They say they also planned to attack the Vatican several years ago. Here with more on this, Tom Joscelyn, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of the Long War Journal, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. But this is news to us today. Tom, we've discussed in the past these documents found in bin Laden's compound. And in some of those letters, there were references to the European brothers. Could this be part of that network?
They probably were part of that network. We know from U.S. intelligence officials who have testified before Congress that more than 400 immediate individual threats were identified in bin Laden's compound, the documents that were taken out of his compound. These guys, the timing of their plots, what they were trying to do is all consistent with that plot. In fact, in 2010, when these guys were planning a plot against Pope Benedict, we know the German authorities, other European nations had to crack down on a variety of plots that were really going after European cities.
Amy Kellogg reported to us earlier that we do not know the why now parts. What do you think that's going to tell us? Do you have any sort of indication as to why now these arrests would be made?
I don't know. This is what's odd about this is why they haven't been arrested earlier, because we know that a lot of the networks that were put in place in Europe around the same time they were put into Europe were actually rolled up. But the important thing here is, and this is what's the most interesting part of this to me, is that these guys were still conspiring with senior al-Qaeda leadership even as the drones were raining down in 2010. Remember, the drone campaign was at its peak in 2010, yet these guys were still conspiring with senior al-Qaeda leadership to launch an attack in Europe.
We use your numbers, by the way, from the Long War Journal and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, as do many other media outlets, because you track the drone strikes. 2010, 117. As you mentioned, the peak, and just for context for our viewers, there's only been five this year. Let me just ask you before we move to that question on drones as well, which is a big story this week, as we're also discussing. What does it say about al-Qaeda as a network? Because we've been told that these terror cells in Europe are small cells, and I think the number of arrests being 18 might surprise some of our viewers and lead us to question, well, if you've arrested 18 today, how many more are out there?
Well, it's interesting. There's sort of a cognitive bias here when it comes to these things, because if you add up all the different individual cells who have been rolled up over the last 5 years, you can see that it's actually quite a few terrorists who have been dispatched to Europe for plots. Now, the good news is the European counterterrorism authorities, U.S. counterterrorism authorities are very good at disrupting these plots and tracking these guys down, disrupting what they want to do. But that doesn't mean the threat has gone away. What we see is that there's actually a broad swath of cells who have been placed in the West to do this sort of thing.
And this arrest today reminds us of that. Okay, let's talk about some of this new information that we have on this U.S. drone strike that killed 2 innocent hostages held by al-Qaeda, an American aid worker, Dr. Warren Weinstein, and an Italian as well. Now, the White House is launching a review, and as we learn, this sort of attack is controversial because the CIA often doesn't know who it's targeting. During our show yesterday, during the 1 o'clock hour, Tom, we had Josh Earnest, the White House press secretary, come out and say, listen, there weren't individuals targeted. It was a compound that was targeted. Tell us a little bit about what you're calling a signature strike and what this shows us about the drone strategy today.
Yeah, this is known as a signature strike as opposed to a personality-based strike. And what that means is they're not going after an individual al-Qaeda leader that they think is in the compound or multiple leaders. They have basically data intelligence which says this is a hot spot, and they think that an al-Qaeda meeting is taking place there, so they're going to rain down the drones on the spot. Now, the two things to this. One, as you can see from this attack, they were right. There were senior al-Qaeda leaders there, so the data actually added up. Unfortunately, on the downside, there's always the what you don't know, and what they didn't know is that these 2 hostages were also there. So you can see both the benefits and the costs of signature strikes in this attack, unfortunately.
As a whole, how effective would you grade the drone strike program that we have?
The drones, and my colleague Bill Roggio, Long War Journal, really has been covering this from the beginning, and he always says they're a very effective tactic, but they're not a strategy. And I think that's right. They're a very effective tactic, but they're not a strategy, because you can see in the bin Laden documents, for example, you can see from a variety of other pieces of evidence that al-Qaeda has taken strategic steps to avoid or limit the impact of the drones, and that really needs to be factored into any calculation.
Just some numbers for our viewers. 383 strikes you've totaled since 2004. The estimate is over 2,700 leaders and operatives from the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and other terrorists apparently have been killed in this. Let me ask you about the propaganda part of it, though, as well. You monitor what jihadis are saying online. What's been the reaction to the statement from the president and the admission by the United States that we killed one of our own?
Well, a couple things. One, they're sort of this. They're marveling at the idea that Adam Gaddan, who was one of the chief American spokesmen for al-Qaeda, somebody who's been a spokesman for them for a long time, he was killed in January, and al-Qaeda still hasn't come out with a eulogy for him. So that raises some questions about why they haven't eulogized him. I don't find that surprising because al-Qaeda sometimes waits a long time to eulogize their leaders. But the second thing is, you notice that they confirmed that Ahmed Farouk, the senior al-Qaeda leader, was killed in January. They came out and said he had been killed, but they didn't say that 2 hostages were killed alongside him. And that's interesting because you would think that that would be a good opportunity from a propaganda perspective for them to come out and say, hey, you killed your own in this drone strike. And that's sort of strange.
What do you make of that? Because the terrorists are particularly adept at propaganda.
I don't know. I don't know what to make of that, to be frank. I mean, I know with Dr. Warren Weinstein, for example, Al-Qaeda had long tried to use him as a bartering chip with the West. Now, they had all sorts of unreasonable demands, but they clearly wanted to use him for propaganda purposes. I don't know if they had some other propaganda idea in mind here that they were going to come out with.
So far, this is a new story, but some interesting context for us today and a lot to consider. It's a busy, busy time. Tom, thank you. As always, great to have you on set with us.
Thanks. Busy time for war. It's supposed to be over.
Absolutely. Good point.